Welcome to the Autism Explained online summit. In this session, our topic is advocating for yourself at work with Michael John Carley. So Michael is an internationally renowned author, speaker, school consultant, trainer, and peer mentor. And in 2001, shortly after his own diagnosis, his experience with a local adult support group led to the foundation of the Global and Regional Asperger Syndrome Partnership, aka GRASP, which quickly became the world's largest membership organization for autistic adults. So since then, Michael has made a huge contribution to the world's understanding of autism, being featured in very many places all around the world, including even addressing the US Congress, I believe. It's great to have you with us today, Michael.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be on. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. It should be fun. So where to start? What's your own experience of discovering your own needs and your own autism and how to start talking to other people about that to understand, to find a way for them to help you with your needs in that sense?
Well, I think it starts with the notion of, first off, realizing that you're not the only person that's going through this. And whatever this might be, whether it's that, checklist of diagnostic elements, inability to, read nonverbal communication, difficulty with eye contact, awkward motor skills, all that sort of jazz that just, it makes us sound, so fascinating to other people. And, when you, initially, I was diagnosed when I was 36 years old. So of course, initially I'm just thinking, okay, well, some people think I'm a tell it like it is kind of a guy, and some people think I'm an asshole. And I don't really think either one of them has me right, but I'm going to go hang out with the ones that think I'm a tell it like it is guy, because I just like hanging out, with people that like me a heck of a lot better, Yeah. And then, all of a sudden, it's, the diagnosis comes your way and it's like, wait a minute, I'm not an asshole. And suddenly all of these, banana peels that existed on your social resume are seen through the context of your wiring and not through any deficiencies in character. And that's a biblical reality that I wish I had the words to be able to relate to you. And one of the things that, really just started, grasp again was this notion of shared experience, which way back then, when even words like Asperger syndrome meant that you were mud and, your life was over, the whole notion of just us getting together socially was thought of as completely impossible. So, there was a lot of, I don't want to get you muddled in what the reality was in 2000, 2001, because thank goodness we're not there. But I mean, the difference for me, I think, was that especially when I started to, meander my way around, I was diagnosed in conjunction with my then 4-year-old son. So I was a parent too, and I had that responsibility. We were literally diagnosed a week apart from one another. And the thing that clearly I noticed was separating me from other parents, this was maybe the first big aha moment I had, was that while they hoped and prayed and begged that their child could have the potential for a happy life, and they had no confidence, though, that was actually going to be the case. Whereas I, who had, a weird life, but, a career and a family that wasn't in any way like a shortchanged career or family, it was a pretty good one. I had proof that their kid had a chance at a happy life because I was the proof. And so sometimes when they try to, tell parents on the spectrum where you're going to be a disadvantage as a father because you're on the spectrum, and it's like, no, you're at the disadvantage because I'm the one who knows that my kid's got a shot. And I'm not going to be spending a lot of time waffling, in the yellow light, like you guys are. I've got the green light. So it's go, go, go. So that was one of the first revelations where I was kind of like, okay, I think adults in this world can provide some help and share some light on a lot of the subjects that the world is wondering about.
And we talk about advocating for yourself in terms of how do I get my employer to understand me? And what I'm hearing from you is that maybe we're skipping a step. Maybe the first step is actually believing in your own strengths and believing that you can do it. And you were quite fortunate in that respect that you had the proof that you could believe it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point, Paul. That's a great point. I would say that, you know, that's great ammunition for whatever your argument is going to be as you advocate for yourself at work. I think that unfortunately, it's a hard thing for us to ask fellow adults on the spectrum to have, only because so many of us have grown up, you know, having been shouted down for their behavioral differences, having endured infinitely more traumatic experiences than I certainly have. And maybe even when the experiences were kind of dark when we were kids, and those of us who just apologized so that the problem would go away, even if they didn't understand what they were apologizing for, those folks usually have a lot more of the anxiety, the depression, the anger when they grow up, because, you know, that sense of self, of not having advocated for yourself when you were small, you know, really has kind of carried them in, because, you know, they did appreciate the fact that it stopped the conversation, it stopped the grown-ups from yelling at them. But at the same point, they couldn't see back then the damage that it would do further on in life. I mean, we all too, you know, when we grow up, we, you know, have to take the sort of the, you know, like what I think you and I were starting to talk about was really, you know, almost the street fighter mentality of having to stick up for yourself, which I actually think is kind of valid. But, you know, obviously we need to grow up a little bit, and we need to respect authority a little bit by the time we get into a job. And so the advocating is a much more diplomatic skill. And I think that number one, it starts with the whens and wheres of disclosure. And disclosure is a much more complicated art or science than I think people realize it is. I think that, you know, well, you just tell somebody you have autism and that's it. And it's like, no, not really, actually. You know, you've got, number one, you're at a disadvantage at a disclosure, because one of the diagnostic traits that folks like you and I have is that we don't read people so well sometimes. So if we're going to be the ones to make that decision about who to disclose to, we have to go into a lifetime of disclosure, understanding that we're going to make a few bad calls, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up about that. There's going to be some good calls too, but we're going to make a few bad calls about who to disclose to. At work, it's actually a little bit easier, because at work, when we disclose, usually there's some protections that we're assuming we're obtaining based on whatever country you live in and whatever laws there might be. And I think it's always very, very helpful in the workplace to disclose in writing and not in person. When we disclose in person, it's not us divulging vulnerable information with the expectation that the person we're disclosing to is going to take care of us, you know, emotionally as well as, you know, materialistically, which is probably why we're asking for them to know this information. When we disclose in front of somebody else, there's the reaction the other person might have. You know, they may know nothing about autism. We may have to do a lot of explaining, which maybe we weren't prepared to do. They may react terribly for reasons which we'll never know and reject what we're saying, which would really throw us, because we're in that vulnerable spot trying to, you know, share this information with people. There's just a lot of unknowns. Whereas if you do it in writing, and you do it, let's say, to your manager or to your boss, your manager or your boss, if they're, whether they're a good person, kind of an idiot, whatever, you know, if they read it on their screen without you in front of them, then they know that if they're going to have a messy reaction to what you're saying about disclosure, about the need for maybe some changes in the office, even if it's just attitude, that they can have their little messy, you know, reaction of saying, oh, he's just using this excuse. Oh, screw him. I can't believe he's pulling this crap out of his hat. You know, blah, 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 blah. You know, he's just got problems to work out. He doesn't have any of these diagnoses. But then he thinks about it. And then whether he changes his mind because he believes you, or whether he changes his mind because he knows it's not smart to call you a liar. Okay. Doesn't matter. He's going to, when you do see him face to face, he will have worked it out. he will have gotten all that messy reaction out. And the other thing, just to close on this, that I'll say is that you always also, if it's in an email, this disclosure to your manager or your boss, CC his supervisor on that email, always.
Mm-hmm. For those who might not know immediately why you would do that, why would you do that?
For accountability for your boss, so that he can't just throw the email in the trash and say, I never heard him disclose to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. And also because that reaction is going to be looked upon. Now eyes are going to be on him to see how he handles it.
Mm.
And, you know, if you ever come across, Paul, I think it's really helpful to tell managers how to handle it. And the best way to handle it is to go to the person that's disclosed to you, if you're that manager, and say, how would you like me to process this?
Mm.
How would you like me to handle this? In other words, you know, you don't have to guarantee the person that disclosed to you anything, but getting that person's wish list and dream list, what a great manager. And then you take it back to your compliance people or your HR people, see if, you know, that's possible, whatever. But that's always the best, because managers, I think, are really intimidated by even, you know, the idea of such an encounter. Whereas, again, if they just say, how would you like me to handle this?
And maybe the answer is, I just want to be able to wear my sunglasses at work. That's the only thing I need. You're like, really?
Exactly.
That's it? You're disclosing to me because of that?
Oh, Paul, managers have these idea that if you ask for accommodations, each accommodation is going to cost them $5 billion. And it's like, I think the average accommodation is like $500 for a company. That's it. So.
So a point that you're touching on is that when we disclose autism, the other person might not necessarily know what that means. So when I say autism, it's going to mean something different to me than when someone else says autism, and we all have different needs and things like that. Which means that if you disclose to someone, the word itself doesn't really describe very much. You have to sort of back it up with something a little bit more useful. Do you have any suggested ways of asking for accommodations, perhaps without using the word autism? Might that be a strategy sometimes?
I think that you would need the word if this was something that was out of the realm of what everybody gets at the office. You know, another complaint you hear about managers is, you know, well, if you're getting special treatment, what are the others going to say? You know, that's a leitmotif that you hear all the time. And sometimes you do need that word, that diagnosis, to be able to change their mind into thinking that it is probably a good idea to give this person something along those lines. But I will also say that I'm not all that sympathetic to managers who are afraid of what the other coworkers are going to think. Best example of this was a guy at a restaurant in Green Bay, Wisconsin, who you know, there was one of our folks was working in the washing dishes in the back, and he, to control his emotional regulation issues, got to take off for 10 minutes at every hour to just go walk around the building, calm down, regulate. And the coworkers complained, and I said, wow, okay, you know, what'd you do? And he said, do you know what my job title is? Manager. I managed them. I was like, right on, brother, right on.
Yeah, because not everyone's going to understand those things, I guess. And it's hard to get people to take you seriously without using the word autism sometimes. That said, it depends also if you want to be advocating just for yourself, or if you want to be advocating for a change of kind of culture in the whole workplace. Sometimes my personal take is, if I allow for a culture that gives people what they need because it's a good idea and it's good for business, then that's also going to be good for the whole business as well.
Yep. But that's taken a long time to convince people of. And a lot of times I think too that the pace with which we've progressed has really kind of thrown people, especially when you look at, you know, the fight that LGBTQ plus and queer people have had in the workplace, where, you know, we literally overnight went from the don't ask, don't tell policy, at least in the United States, to suddenly everybody caring about their diversity inclusion numbers and needing more people to add to those numbers. So, you know, you can't just go from don't ask, don't tell to, can everybody please disclose? Please, 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 we need our numbers higher. You know, that's just really hard for a lot of companies. It's a real culture shift. And I would say that most, you know, if we're talking about big businesses, which unfortunately is where usually everybody, you know, sort of gravitates towards, you know, I've looked at and I've worked with all those HR departments and diversity inclusion departments, and, you know, unfortunately 90% of them are still just race and gender departments, and they're only interested in client and in compliance. They're not interested in innovation, even though they use the word all the time. They're not thought leaders, even though they put that on their LinkedIn bios. You know, they're just they're there for the optics, their word, not mine, you know, just to show that they're, you know, diversity, inclusion, compliant, or what have you. Whereas the real ones, you know, are the innovators. The real ones are the ones that weren't dragged kicking and screaming into LGBTQ inclusion, and, you know, and in ways that can make people really, really feel welcome. And that's been a big culture shift that I question whether or not we're really going to succeed with uber corporate atmospheres. I think that it's, you know, obviously where most of the jobs are going to reside, but you have this real, I think, you know, sort of conundrum here, which is that so much of corporate behavior is defined by what is thought of as professional behavior. How do we get these diagnoses? From behavioral differences. And that's a conundrum that I don't think has really been had as a conversation between, you know, the advocacy crowd and the big business crowd. But, you know, usually it does sometimes start with, you know, a small smattering of people. I think also that the good news is that, you know, the data is irreversibly concluding now that the more diversified your company is, the more you will outperform your peers. And all disabilities, not just the autism spectrum, have been a supremely neglected part of diversity and inclusion strategies. And the reason for that is because they're infinitely more complicated than all the others. If you have a support group or what's called an employee resource group, it's really just a support group, but that's what the corporates call it. Otherwise, you know, called an ERG. And if you have that ERG, let's say for your males who are of African descent, they're going to be very different people within the company, but they're going to have some sense of shared experience within that support network that will justify, you know, things that they don't feel comfortable saying to people that are not males of African descent within that company. Or if you have even, you know, a broad spectrum of, you know, let's say gender within your queer population in a company, still you will, you know, that's a little bit even more diverse, but you'll still have some sense of shared experience that maybe those folks don't feel comfortable talking about with the rest of the company. Disabilities, you could have somebody in a wheelchair, you could have somebody who's blind, you could have somebody with cystic fibrosis, you could have somebody that's going through their third round of chemotherapy, and you've got the guy with Asperger's syndrome, and maybe you've got, you know, a veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? Not a lot of shared experience there. And this is one of the reasons why it's been hard for us to integrate disabilities into corporations, is not because they're bad people, it's because they don't have the confidence to be able to integrate folks. And in the nonprofit field, sometimes we think, well, it's just like us, you know, we take a risk and we look good if we failed because it looked like we were trying. But that's not the way it works in corporate America, which is one of its faults. They have shareholders that they have to answer to. And it's all about the bottom line. And they're never going to get away from that.
So in your experience, is there any way to use their own language, talk about the bottom line, show that investment opportunity that has been shown to, you know, increase the performance of companies in a way that can be useful when advocating for your own needs at work?
Well, again, I think the aforementioned data is finally starting to veer in our favor on that. You know, it is stuff like the Harvard Business Review. It is stuff like teaching managers that, you know, let's say you've got a really out there spectrum guy, okay, you know, who's in your company, not just, you know, one of the, pedantic Aspies or whatever. You've got somebody who's really, outside the box thinking. And let's say that 19 out of 20 of the suggestions that he has are all outside the box, but they're just, when you really put them under analysis, they're not useful. But the 20th thing he throws out there is going to make you $5 gazillion. And that's the type of thinking that we can shift people into forgiving those first 19 instances to get to the 20th. And that was what was not happening 5 or even 10 years ago. I mean, 10 or even 5 years ago.
So we've talked about the challenge with much larger employers. Do you have any tips on finding an understanding or accommodating employer where it might be more realistic to advocate for your own needs?
Sure. I think that you have a good and a bad that is associated with small businesses, because you're going to be infinitely more dependent on the quality of the person that's in that business, because there's really no accountability for how they treat you. But you can make a lot of headway there too, because they can pretty much, usually do what they want in the small business world. And I think that, quite frankly, the solution to our, employment crisis was always going to be, the creation of more small businesses. I think big business is never going to really dip or rise that much in the employment sphere anyway. But it's the creation of smaller businesses that the current economic times, especially when we have such a ridiculous, income discrepancy between the CEOs and the people in the mailroom, that's just going to drive people further and further away. So I would hope that, being able to advocate yourself in the small business arena is going to be infinitely more about really just one-on-one relationships rather than compliance, because they don't have to answer to anybody.
So some of us aren't very good at relationships. Assuming that, what are some of the things that we can do to show our worth or bring our best selves to work, I guess, so that our managers, even in small businesses, are really motivated to find ways to keep us on and make that relationship work when there might be some inherent challenges there?
Honestly, Paul, you know what I hope for 5 or 10 years down the road? That the biggest solution has to do with, are all people like you and me becoming infinitely more eloquent in how we share the fact that we're not so good at relationships. And understanding too that, we might have other areas in our life that compensate for the relationships that, we want but don't have. But also that there really isn't the desire for the same type of relationship. And that's nothing that really invites anybody else's judgment on us for that. Tell you, right off the bat, I mean, it's like, I don't really have that many friends. And I am certainly never going to be the, oh no, bowling night on Tuesday. I got my Tuesdays all repped up for bowling night. It's like, that's not going to happen. And I see my wife, and she's got, these 3 friends from middle school. Okay. They've grown into vastly different people, politically and religiously, but they still maintain a tightness in a relationship. And it's really amazing to kind of watch. And I'm so happy for her, because I see that my wife benefits from that. But when I look at that, do I want something like that for myself? I'm like, no. Why would you spend so much time on that? I don't get it. I need to be closer to the people I work with than neurotypicals do. They've got their boundaries. I need to be closer to the people that I work with. And I also just, have so much fun with my family. It's like I hang out with my wife and my boys, and I'm just like, why would I want to do the friends thing? Why? This is so much more fun.
Yeah, and I guess it's easy for people on the outside to see competence in one area and assume that, oh, well, if you've managed to work it out in this area, then you must have done it in all of your other areas as well.
Yes, correct. And that's just because they haven't seen us in all those particular arenas, and especially when you get into the area of the spectrum that can better mirror greater society, or individuals that have, as they've grown older, have developed masking strategies. You know, I think that disbelief is enormously hurtful, and really can invalidate all of the hard work that folks like you and I have done to achieve whatever we've been able to achieve. Because, you know, the one thing that Brenda Smith-Miles said a long time ago that I always loved is that, you know, you can give accommodations to your employee on the spectrum, but you've got to understand that that employee's been accommodating himself to you 100 times what you'll ever accommodate to him.
Yeah, and if those if what we are doing to accommodate ourselves to the environment is not seen, then it's hard for people to understand the degree to which that happens.
Correct. Yeah. They just don't want to believe it. I think part of the reason they don't want to believe it, though, Paul, is because I think that it still hurts if neurotypicals find out that an individual on the autism spectrum works harder than you, is a better romantic partner, is a better parent. That's a long time before we're going to see that one rectified. But yeah, I think that, you know, the more that people know about how much harder we're working than they are, that there's going to be a resentment factor. We have a disability. We should be less than, not more than. But that's the shift too, in treating folks like us, not as problems to be solved, but as assets and values.
So bringing this back around to us realizing our own value, in your latest book on unemployment, you talk about building confidence a lot. Can you talk a little bit about what we might do, or even what parents might be able to help their children do to instill as much confidence as is possible, so that we are then able to advocate for ourselves?
Well, I think one of the mistakes that parents make about building confidence is always giving your kids success stories. I think that we learn to process failure by failing. Now, we can't sometimes have the same experiences growing up as neurotypicals. We can't maybe go play on the same sports teams, you know, or what have you, but there should always be an effort to provide, you know, maybe developmentally similar learning experiences, so that we can learn how to fail and fail with grace. You know, like I had a grandfather that was a boxer at one point in his life, and you know, he had this great lesson where he was just like, I don't care if you win or lose, but if you get knocked down, I want you to get up quick. You know, that's all he cared about. And I think a large part of that confidence comes from that, you know, if you're on the spectrum, you know that there's some social banana peel that's lurking around the corner. Okay. And you know it's there. You don't know when it's going to hit, and you don't know how hard it's going to be this time, but you know it's there. But if you know through repeated experiences with failure that it's not going to kill you, that's half the battle right there. And the rest of it, I think, is that the beauty of confidence is something that you can really create it out of nothing. You know, confidence doesn't care how much money you have in your bank. It doesn't care how many resources you have. Confidence doesn't care about the junk in your pants and how big it is. It really doesn't. That's not how confidence works. It's something that you really can manifest just from sheer trying. And I kind of see a lot of people on the spectrum, without knowing that that's what they're doing, you know, working like exactly that. I'm going to achieve this university degree, even though, let's say, their parents have been telling you, you're not being realistic. And maybe that person doesn't achieve the university degree, but the fact that they gave themselves the shot to try means that they'll learn from that and take it into the next one, as opposed to learning this provincial lesson from the world around you that you're not good enough and just going, okay, that's not a good idea. That's not going to build confidence.
Yeah, because the opposite lesson that a lot of us kind of internalize is the kind of perfectionist tendencies, that if I make any mistake, that it's going to be a problem.
No, make mistakes. Make mistakes. I've done a ton.
Start a social mistakes club.
Amen to that.
Okay, well, we should probably wrap up soon. So given that there are going to be a lot of parents and maybe teachers watching this, thinking, how can I help my young person have more confidence and advocate for themselves? Do you have any final words that you'd like them to take away of how to help someone advocate for themselves?
I think number one, understand that this is about your kid and not about you. That was one of the first lessons for me as a parent. I think trying to be creative and trying to be inventive as opposed to following the scripts. I think one of the things that we know about all inclusion, for instance, like, you know, if, for instance, you wanted your child, whether they were, you know, well, let's say they were heterosexual, okay? The really inclusive parents, even knowing that, take their kids, even knowing that they're heterosexual too, they take their kids to LGBTQ events. That's how to be inclusive. It's not by just approving of the fact that you're different. Show that you, the parent, are different. Show that you're not just tolerant of people that are different. Show that you value people who are different by taking them to, you know, the spectrum events, but also, again, all the other elements of diversity and inclusion. That's how we change the world, is basically by teaching the kids that, you know, tolerate isn't a compliment, and it's not a significant step in the socially significant world that I think we all want, you know? So get creative, throw the scripts out the window.
Okay, great advice. Thanks for that, Michael. And for everyone else watching at home, I hope you've found this session very valuable, and make sure you check out all the other speakers at the Autism Explained online summit. Thanks.
Paul, thank you so very, very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fun.